You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show continuing to talk about the top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments in 2023. And then to talk about them, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today talking about number 5 and number 4 from that top 10 list. And number 5 is the Corps of Engineers Mismanaging Water Levels in the Missouri River.
Yeah, this actually started over a decade ago, and it was a problem that was created that goes all the way back, actually almost 20 years ago, but the lawsuit started in 2014 when you had about 400 farmers along the Missouri River from Kansas to North Dakota that sued the federal government, claiming that what the Corps did in terms of managing the water levels in the Missouri River caused repeated flooding of their farmland along that Missouri River corridor. And they claim that the flooding that occurred as a result of what the Corps did in 2007 and 8 and then 10 and 11 and 13 and 14 got so bad that it amounted to a taking by the federal government of their farm ground, which triggered compensation under the Fifth Amendment. That was their claim.
And something kind of associated in with this, the master manual from the Corps of Engineers?
Yeah, the Corps changed their manual in 2004, and they said, well, we've got to have more water in the Missouri River to comply with Endangered Species Act requirements. And they did that even though we had a record amount of snowmelt in the state of Montana that was filling up the Missouri River, and it was already at high levels. And then they released more water because of the change in their manual, which they said they had to because of endangered species requirements under the Endangered Species Act. They released more water from the Gavins Point Dam in South Dakota, which created what was already a flooding issue into a massive flooding problem. And that's what the farmers alleged constituted a taking.
So what did the farmers say kind of when they've gotten to court and in with the government?
Well, their basic claim, again, was that this was a Fifth Amendment taking, that the government, you can do this, but because you destroyed our property and we can't farm it, you've destroyed our crops, our growing crops, our planted crops, you have to pay us for that. You're the big bad government. You can do that, but the Constitution requires you to pay for it. And in essence, their property law claim was that the government took a flowage easement on their property. And by taking that, that's a property right that was taken from the farmers along the Missouri River corridor that the government had to pay for.
What is the government going to have to pay these farmers?
Well, the courts did agree with the farmers that a flowage easement was taken, and it is compensable under the Fifth Amendment, and so the legal issue is done. Now we're just down to the damages, and the appellate court said that, yes, this also includes crops that were destroyed and crops that would have been planted and future damages for those farmers. So it's going to be a massive amount that the federal government's going to be responsible for paying for these farmers by acquiring a flowage easement impermissibly under the Constitution.
And this isn't just farmers in Kansas, correct?
Correct. There's just a few in Kansas, in the extreme northeast corner of Kansas, but this is all along the corridor, Nebraska, Iowa, a little bit in Minnesota, and South Dakota and North Dakota, pretty much all the way up to Fargo.
Roger, is it fair to say then that basically everything's done, but just waiting to see what that number is of what gets paid out?
Yeah, we're down to the issue of the expert's computation of damages. So this is the expensive, if there is a more expensive phase of the litigation, this is it. But the legal principle is settled, and that is that the Corps is going to have to pay for what they took, and they took a flowage easement.
Roger, moving on to number 4 of these top 10 developments, and this one involving the Employee Retention Credit. And what is that?
Well, the Employee Retention Credit was a mess, is what it is. Technically, it's a refundable tax credit that was created in 2020 as a result of what economic problems were created by the virus in 2020. It was revised in 2021, and what it is was if you had a business with a certain number of employees, the government was going to, and you were affected by, I should say this, you were affected by a state governor that required you to shut your business down, then the federal government came in and said, well, we'll give you what's known as a credit, a refundable credit to incentivize you to keep your employees on the payroll. So if you have to shut down, but you still have to meet payroll, well, that's going to create substantial economic harm to you. So here comes this tax credit in saying, here. Now, based on the number of employees you had, based on your drop in revenues, you had to show a decline in revenues by a certain percentage. You could apply for this credit, and it could be massive in terms of dollars amounts. It could be really high. But you had to show a drop in your revenue or that you were affected by a government shutdown or at least a partial shutdown. And this was pitched to a lot of farmers.
So more than likely, farmers and ranchers' income wasn't impacted by the virus because they just kept doing their job?
Right. Farmers basically didn't shut down. They were not subjected to any government order. I mean, how stupid would you have to be to order farmers to stop producing? That's not going to work. And so farmers were not affected by a government shutdown or a partial shutdown. And the IRS said that supply chain disruptions don't count for this. Now, some farmers were affected by that. That was a major problem in getting supplies and getting parts, but that doesn't count in terms of being affected by a government shutdown. And so it really fell back to whether you showed a sufficient enough reduction in revenues to still get the credit. Well, you look back in 20 and 21, and your base year for computation was how far your revenue declined compared to 2019. And if we look at the data for those years, those were pretty good years. And so most farmers didn't show a reduction in revenue, at least not to the extent required to get the credit. But yet the fraudsters grabbed hold of this credit and started pitching it to all types of people, even those that didn't have businesses, as well as to farming operations. And there were claims that were filed, and then after the fact, some farmers, in fact, a lot of farmers and a lot of other businesses realized that, oh, we really weren't eligible for that credit. Now we've got a problem.
For that mess that was created, what if they're realizing I'm not someone who is eligible for that?
Well, the IRS realized that this was so bad that they stopped processing employee retention credit claims for the fourth quarter of 2023. So no claims were processed for October, November, and December, even if it was a legitimate claim. They just said, we can't keep up with the fraud on this. We're not going to process any more claims. Then they came in the very late part of 2023 and created an amnesty program that said that if you pay it back, we're not going to come after you. We're going to give you amnesty. And basically, this is a voluntary disclosure program that you've got until middle of March to comply with. And basically what it has evolved into is if you will pay back 80% of what was provided to you and you think that you now realize you shouldn't have received anything, if you'll just pay us back 80% of what you received, then we'll leave you alone. You won't be audited. You won't be subject to fines and penalties, because the fines and penalties can be terrible once IRS finds this out. And so IRS knows they've got an administrative problem. They're trying to get people in this amnesty program so they don't have to go through all of this. It takes a lot of man hours to do this, but they will find those claims, and then you can get hit with penalties and interest on that, and it would be awful. And so they're just saying, pay us 80% back if you think you filed a fraudulent claim, or now you know that you did. You didn't know it at the time, but now you know that you did, and we'll leave you alone. And they're going to they've announced they're really ramped up the prosecution of these fraudsters that have created these mills that have been churning these credit claims.
For people who have realized they've done a fraudulent claim, when do they need to have that submitted back to the IRS?
Well, they have to. This program is going to close on March 22, 2024. So a business has to apply to the voluntary disclosure program by that time, and certain qualifications have to be satisfied for a business to participate in that program. You can find information of that on the IRS website if you're interested in that voluntary disclosure program. But this was such a mess. Normally, a tax credit that's not specifically associated with agriculture would never make my top 10 list. But this became so bad and such a systemic problem that affected so many farmers, it ends up in my top 10 list.
And as we're talking about taxes, what should maybe producers do to make sure they don't fall into a trap or a mill like this again?
On this one specifically, if you weren't affected by a shutdown, and you probably were not as a farmer, and if you were affected by a supply chain disruption, that doesn't count. And if you didn't have a sufficient drop in revenue, and it's an 80%, 20% cutoff compared to the same calendar quarter in 2019, then you're not going to be eligible. And so if you receive something, if you filed a claim, you had one of these mills file a claim for you, and they took a percentage of what your amount of the credit would be, then pay 80% back of what you received, and you're going to be in the clear. In terms of trying to avoid similar things like this in the future, always talk to your tax professional first. This is something that we addressed numerous questions on in the K-State tax schools in the fall of 23. We're still addressing the questions as we start tax season now in terms of particularly this voluntary disclosure program and how do we get rid of these bogus claims. But always talk to your tax professional first and before you get into something with a group that might not be reputable or that you haven't heard of before. So always do your research, talk to your tax practitioner, have them look up things for you just to make sure that it's all on the up and up.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us your number 4 and number 5 for top agricultural law and tax developments in 2023.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. You can read more on these by going to washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, where I will also link them in today's show notes on agtoday.net.